A Conversation with John Conenna is sponsored in part by Health Markets Insurance, your specialist for health, Medicare, small group, life, and supplemental. See our specialist, Maximilian Bujowski, for your insurance need. He is located at 7418 West Belmont Avenue in Chicago. Again, Health Markets is a proud sponsor of A Conversation with John Conenna. And now on to our episode. Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. This afternoon, we go back to that thing that we really love to talk about. It's that game of hockey. And today we have author and hockey historian Grant Douglas Pennell joins us today to talk about the great 1972 Russian hockey series, which is proclaimed probably one of the greatest series in sports history. He has written a book, Grant Pennell has written a book called Sitting on Tretiak. This is the book. It is a book that of no other when we talk about this series. The book just came out. I had a chance to get it, and Grant, this is fantastic. I'm going to start by asking you a question just about you, and then I'm going to ask you the second question quickly. How are you doing today, young man, and what's going on with you?
Things are going good. Actually, a golf teaching professional, so I'm kind of winding up the season here in Toronto. The weather's beautiful today, so hopefully we're getting kind of an Indian summer for the next few weeks. But I've my old timers hockey league has started, and then on the other side, I'm going to working on part two, so which is called Waving at Brezhnev.
And that'll be a spin-off of Sitting on Tretiak, correct?
Well, it's the 4 games in actually 6 games that they played, 2 in Sweden, 4 in Moscow, and 1 in Prague. So right, I'm going to talk about those games. I'm going to do a little bit about European hockey history. I'm going to talk a bit about the time of 1972 with the Russian United States basketball game and the Olympics, the big chess match that was going on at the time, and just kind of set the tone for what it was like for a bunch of Canadian professional hockey players to go over to Soviet Russia. And, Soviet, it wasn't Russia at the time, it was Soviet Union, and play hockey and try and work that into the summary of the final games in Europe.
So you're going to start to work on it. So here's the question that I wanted to add. And again, this again is something on Brezhnev. You said it and I forgot it just quickly.
Waving at Brezhnev. So
waving at Brezhnev.
Yeah, it's because
we have something about Phil Esposito too.
Exactly. When he falls and he gives a little wave. When he stands up, he bows and gives a wave. So I just thought it was a fun title.
That is a great one. And you know what, Grant? I remember Phil saying in some documentaries along the way, he says he made eye contact with Brezhnev, but
they were actually sitting right there up in the stand. Of course, he had prime seats, but all the Soviet brass was there because it was very important to them. People don't realize that this was their opportunity to showcase and with communist ideology, showcasing their proficiency in sports was very important. As they dominated the Olympics, in multiple sports for the next, 10, 15 years as well.
Well, the question to open it up, besides asking how you are and everything, and this is great that you've come on here today. How did you get the title Sitting on Tretiak, where we have the great Frank Mahovlich sitting on Tretiak to start our series?
I think I looked at that point, and I made it in the book as kind of the rock bottom for Team Canada. So, and I look at it with that, the Canadian players by Game 4 were so frustrated, not in great shape. They weren't a team. They were a bunch of all-stars. They were playing a very cohesive, very fit opponent that they had no answer for at that time, and they were really hit the proverbial wall in conditioning. And in the second period of the game, Tretiak comes out of his net. Frank Mahovlich collides with him and decides it's a good hockey play to hold him down and sit on him, and that really started the booze in Vancouver. It didn't happen at the beginning of the game. I mean, it happened as the plays went on and Canada's penalties played like a bunch of, beer league players really for a lot of the game, slashing and hacking. And then when Frank Mahovich did that, and I call him in the book kind of, he was the all Canadian boy, good looking, aw shucks, and he was a hero to many. And for him to be doing that, I felt it was really the rock bottom. It was Casey at the bat and kind of striking out. And so I just thought that was a perfect moment to describe the 4 games in Canada.
So you depicted this picture to put on in front of your fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's go right into it with again, I want to tell you the book is just, I mean, you talk about in depth. You didn't miss anything and how you connected the history of,
I tried to anyways. Yeah.
The series was just unbelievable. And then, breaking down how they scored, what was going on in the play.
Mm-hmm.
No one, I mean, unless somebody's out there that can tell me and you what has happened, this is really in depth. And I didn't think it was going to be in depth. And this is what really attracted to me to get a hold of you. But let's get right into game 1 of that evening. It's a Saturday night in September.
Mm-hmm.
I will never forget it because I had gone to a wedding. I was 12 years old and I was telling my father all the way there, I hope there's a television at this banquet hall because I need to watch this game because the Canadian team is just going to destroy the Russians.
Yeah, everybody thought that.
And I'll never forget, I think we were having the antipasto at this place. And I had heard that it was either Mahovlich or Phil Esposito actually scored that first goal. They were saying Mahovlich.
Yeah, it was Esposito, but they originally credited to Frank.
I think about maybe 5 or 6 minutes later, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul Henderson scores from the draw.
Yeah.
And I think when I had finished my soup that night, it was 2-0. And I says, well, I'm not going to watch this. And then, of course, we find out after the dancing at that wedding, it's a 7-3 final. And I went up to the bartender and said, and I was a little boy asking for a Coke. You sure you got the right score?
Yeah.
The game, just from the onset with Sinden and the whole thing and how you kind of opened it up here today, did the Canadians really take them lightly in game 1? Was it hot in the forum? Was it just unconditioned players?
It was the kind of the perfect storm. So it was a accumulation of many things. So if you want to start, the fact that Canada had been propped up by not necessarily the players themselves. I don't think they really truly believed they were going to score 10 goals, but they started to believe it as the media kept telling, and even the hockey experts. If you look back on the predictions, all the NHL brass, all predicted 7-8 game sweep for Canada, and some of the media was just making crazy predictions, 8-0 first game and things like that. And looking back, it's shocking to think that, because the Canadian national team in the mid 60s played 8 exhibition games against the NHL, 4 against the original 6 teams, so Detroit and the New York Rangers, and they went 4-4 against NHL competition. Then in the last 2-3 years of playing the Soviet national team, they went 3-21. So if you're looking at it, could the Montreal Canadiens of that era have beaten the Canadian national team, 21 games out of 25 games? And probably not. So it was really just, there was no internet, there was no real television, no one had ever really had the opportunity. But if you go online and watch a YouTube game of 1969 between the Czechs and the Soviets, you can tell in about the first 5 seconds that they are much more than they were anticipated to be. They're definitely at least AHL level. They're a national team. They were AHL All-Star level.
Are you talking like this new game itself that they brought to the program and the quickness, Grant? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they were just very good hockey players. They were, and they played a different game, but just individually, and now we know it. You even on the Czech team, you had Nedomansky and a lot of other players that were world-class players. We just didn't know. And then the whole Soviet team was full of, Hall of Famers. Harlamov, Yakushev, Mikhailov, Maltsev. I can go on and on. Even
Sure.
guys that a lot of people don't know about, Petrov, and then you had the young Tretiak in goal. I mean, now we know that this was facing players that were as good as the very best over here, but we just had no idea at the time. So that was part one. Part two was it was about 100 degrees outside that day in Montreal.
Sure.
Team Canada had somehow purchased sweaters that were very tight and extremely restricting. So they probably couldn't breathe. Number three is obviously they weren't in great shape. Players back then, went to the cottage, they drank beer, they barely any of them ever worked out, except for one exception, except for the one line that did very well, which is Bobby Clark, Henderson, and Ellis. They were all fitness freaks. Bobby Clark used to run 6 miles a day, so, and Henderson always says in his books that he was always in great shape. So that was the exception. But so there's two more factors there. And then Harry Sinden just made a ton of lineup mistakes that really killed Team Canada. And I talk about that in the book.
Yeah, you broke it down tremendously. Yeah. That you talk about, because matter of fact, I wound up watching it the other night again, so I could match up to what you were talking about, like I said, which is phenomenal in this book. So I was watching this and I was like, wow, the euphoria of being in the Forum. And of course, right after this, they play the Russian national anthem, you hear, the O Canada, which is in the French language.
Sure.
That place was, and of course, when Henderson scores, you think, okay, this is going to be a blowout.
Pneumonia.
It reminded me of the great director Alfred Hitchcock. The change now comes into the Forum, and it was like, what is going on here?
Well, the Soviets were admittedly, they weren't that old. They were admittedly a little overwhelmed in the first few minutes by the whole. They never played in Canada. They never left their country. Many of them,
Sure.
If they had been to Sweden or Finland or Czechoslovakia, and they were very controlled. They were not allowed to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, they come to Canada, and they've heard these legendary teams and professionals, that they were going to slaughter them, and they just didn't know. They weren't even. Boris Mikhailov says, when they played the funeral march after the second goal, he's just thinking to himself, oh my God, we're in big trouble here. But these were great players. They had played together, and they just started to play their game. And Canada didn't really have a lot of answers for it. And some of their strategies was great. And I talk about that. They borrowed from the old Boston Celtics fast break, kind of thing, from Kuzi to Russell down the court kind of thing,
Good analogy.
And that's what they did. All of a sudden, they'd be in one end. They'd have a guy at the far boards, not the 2-line pass, but they would play it off the boards and then have Harlamov or something just burst to the puck like a fast break. Canadians were not used to that at all. They had no answer for it, and it was just like, what is this? And it ended up in the net. A couple of the goals right away started that way, and they did it on him again in shorthanded in Winnipeg. And it took them a long time to adapt to some of these tactics.
And then, you know what, I think Paul Henderson says it too in another documentary, before we had this interview. He says, they would come up and then they would revert back. Because we never saw something like this.
It's the soccer mentality. If they didn't like what they saw, they would just regroup.
They would set up.
And they were great passers. So they had confidence on the puck. And the other thing which people don't talk about is what I call in the book a 2-man swarming forecheck. So they just caused the defense all kinds of problems. They would have one guy in the puck, second guy right there. They put 2 guys on, the third guy would move over, and they just had no space. And then mix that with Sinden's terrible decisions to go with 5 defensemen in 100-degree heat, and 2 of them were kind of journeyman defensemen in Don Ari and Sealing. Fine AHL players, but maybe not equipped for this level of play.
International play, yes.
Yeah, and then he didn't play Guy Lapointe a lot. Guy Lapointe came out, and Don Ari got burned by Harlamov, and he stopped playing him. So then he went with 4 defensemen for much of the game. And that led to the third period collapse. In the third period, with about 7 minutes left, it was 4-3 for the Soviets, and they were being penned by Canada. Canada was ready to score. Sure. And the 10-minute mark, actually, it was a little bit less than that. It was the 10-minute mark went off, first few minutes, and then you just saw the collapse. Soviets went down and scored, and Canadian defense they were gassed. They had nothing left. So the score was not really vindicative. It was actually a much closer game than people realize. People think, the urban legend is, they came in and just skated rings around them. Canada was ready to tie the game up at about the 8-minute mark. So
at that time, but I got to tell you, does the because even Phil, before the famous speech, says it was hot. It was hot with his Canadian accent from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. It was hot in the building. It was hot. I mean, being out of shape and everything else. How critical now does Sinden take this game, in your opinion? And I think you broke it down in the book, where game 2 now in Toronto, really now, for all of us as the fan, as the coach, as the player, we're scratching our heads. How critical, they've called game 2 a game that saved Canada. Do you agree with that or no?
So I agree with 100%. But I think it was a great foreshadowing of what was to come, because I truly believe, and I'll talk about this in the next book, I truly believe that the separating factor between the two teams was the fact that Canadian players had been battle hardened since the time that you're young in Canada and you're playing high level hockey. You're playing in playoff series. So through midget, through junior, you're playing in the long grind to get to the final of any league you're in. And you're playing 7-game series, and then of course the Stanley Cup playoffs. Even back then, it was 2 or 3 rounds, and so they were used to bringing that kind of mentality, raising their game up to a real heavy, hard, not necessarily dirty game, but just like, we're going to grind you down and win kind of playoff atmosphere. And that's what they brought to game 2. And I think the Soviets really should have taken note, because that was what was going to happen to them in game 6, 7, and 8 as well in Moscow. Is Canada would raise it to a level where it's like, okay, you might have a lead, but we're not giving up, and we're used to this. We're playoff players, and we're going to grind you down until we win the series. Something the New York Islanders used to do from 80 to 83. Like
exactly.
They just would not lose, and they would send waves after wave of player in on you and physical, and by the end of the series, the other team was gassed. So I think game 2 was a real microcosm of that. They went with some more physical players in Cashman, Parise. They brought out a great defensive defenseman in Bill White, Serge Savard. And all of a sudden, the Soviets didn't have a lot of room to do their usual circling. You're not going to circle the puck when Cashman has you in the corner. And Parise was a bulldog on the boards. The Soviets just weren't used to that kind of game. Like, those were real professional, straight ahead NHL style plays. And you can see in the first goal, Cashman goes in the corner. He kind of takes out Lachenko, and fires it on net. And then Esposito's there to score. And there's another interesting little play where in game 1, Harlamov comes down on Don Ari in the first game, sees he can go around him, and a few minutes later, that's where he scores the famous goal. But in game 2, he tries to go left, and he tries to go around Bill White, who just angles him beautifully to the boards. And the rest of the game, you could see Harlamov wouldn't go over there. He's just like, I'm not messing with that guy, kind of thing, because I can't get around him. And I think that was the big difference. And they went with 6 defense. They were much ready. And Tony Esposito was much more prepared and able athletically to play against that type of game.
Well, you brought up a good point just in a phone conversation we had before we set up the Zoom. You had taught me something that I didn't know about, where Dryden, what's the term? I think it was the east to west type of play, and the north to south, right?
North
Correct.
South. Yeah. He was just too big of a man. I mean, he was great for the NHL, where guys would fly down the wing and fire slap shots. He was a big man. He could come out a little bit and cover that net. And you had nowhere to shoot. But the problem was the Soviets wouldn't do that very often. If they did, they would do it when you weren't expecting it. And Dryden also had a history. He got lit up, and I talk about this in the book, as for part of the Canadian national team when he was young against the Soviets, and I think that was in his head a lot. I think, and he never played well. He played good in Game 6. He didn't play well in the New Year's game in 1976. He just really had trouble playing the European teams, and I think he was just too big of a man. It wasn't his style.
I have to tell you to go back to the game 2 in Toronto. Okay, so I know they lose game 1, 7-3. The game 2 in Toronto. Of course, now the Russians are coming in there not even though it was early in the game or early in the series, they had that confidence brewing. That first period, and I have to tell you, because he was my idol and I saw him play so many times in the Chicago Stadium, I still say to this day that is Tony Esposito's finest hour. Because
he was fantastic.
That first period, the Russians were all over him like a rash.
Yeah,
and he was just phenomenal. And Gabe, I think, kind of turned the light switch on.
He did, because they made a few of those cross crease passes, backdoor passes, and Esposito was so quick that he was able to get there. And I'm throwing out my leg under the table, not that you can see, but he was throwing out his leg under the table, quickly to make the toe save. That Dryden just didn't have that ability.
Right.
He just wasn't his game. And Esposito was the perfect guy. And another guy who would have been very good would have been Jerry Cheevers, who played that type of game well. And you see that 2 years later when he plays for the WHA, Cheevers plays fantastic. So I think you don't play Dryden in game 1, you don't play Dryden in game 4. You make the right choices, maybe Canada's not so hard done in the series.
Yeah, great point by you. And of course, I know we'll the players that didn't play in game 1, game 2, players that were upset, like we talk about Vic Hatfield. Rattel didn't play in game 2, but Rattel, I think that night Rattel got an award from the Prime Minister.
For the
Remember that
award for being the best player in the league, voted by the players, and he's not being dressed.
Yeah, that was like what?
Very odd. Yeah,
very odd.
Yeah.
Not to to go there. Do you think Sinden, because Sinden was coaching that team because of them winning the Stanley Cup the year before against the New York Rangers?
He wasn't the coach. So
no, that's right.
Tom Johnson was the coach.
Tom
was
Johnson.
unemployed at the time. He had been working in Rochester, New York.
Okay, so then Grant, how does Sinden become the coach of Team Canada?
Well, they wanted a coach that wasn't coaching in the AHL because training camp had to start, and they wanted somebody to focus on that. Sinden had played for the Whitby Dunlops in the World Championships for a couple of years and played in I think the 1960 Olympics as well with Galt Terriers for Team Canada. So he had international experience as a hockey player. Playing against the Soviets. He was a very good coach up to that point. He had done well in the Central Hockey League and been coach of the year. And then he had taken the Bruins to a championship in 69-70. Problem is that the Bruins, as were teams of that time, were tightwads and they didn't want to pay him. So he quit. And when he quit, they kind of blackballed him a little bit for the NHL, so he couldn't go get another job, which again, typical NHL mindset of that era. And so he went and took a job with a construction company in Rochester, New York. But Eagleson and the Eagleson was the guy Alan Eagleson was the guy who wanted Sinden. He pitched him to Hockey Canada, who had a say in the thing. And I think Sinden did an interview, and I think it was a no-brainer after that. Then Sinden chose John Ferguson as his single assistant.
Right, at that time. So yeah, that another bit of information that is fantastic that we did not know about. So what I was getting at, from game 1 to game 2, of course, now they win game 2 4-1. They're in Toronto. Do you think that Sinden now really is coaching, or is Sinden and Ferguson are coaching, or are Sinden and Ferguson letting everybody play? Like say the gag line, Rattel, Gilbert, Vic Hatfield, they were doing their own thing out there. We're freelancing.
Yeah, no, I think maybe game 1, he was caught a little. Sinden was caught a little behind, kind of thing, maybe to unsure what was happening out there at times. And I think he lost a little bit of his bench management with the ice time, and historians have done that. Since then, and learned that he did mismanage the defenseman, and that caused a lot of the issues. But to be fair, he turned it around in game 2, and he had an interesting system, which as a hockey guy I probably wouldn't have thought of, but it obviously worked. Which was, instead of covering the points, he had the wingers come back into the corners and help out the defenseman. And that goes back to my point about the swarming forecheck of the Soviets. So instead of them being outnumbered, the wingers could now come back and help out the defenseman. I think that helped a lot, in getting them to help the defensemen who were being a little overwhelmed at times. Because the Soviets were great skaters, but they were also strong as bulls on their skates. So they might not have been that big, but they had that Sidney Crosby build. It was like a team of Sidney Crosby. So, you're facing that stocky, strong in your skate, and you just couldn't get the puck off them. And that was difficult, even though Canadian defensemen were big, strong guys. It's not that easy to take the puck off somebody when you've got that great center of gravity and you can really, use your edging to get away from them. So
I have to tell you, the way you break things down, and of course, like you break down the historical of the series in the book, though, this is that's why I want to hold up the book again. And we're talking today to Grant Douglas Pennell about his book, Sitting on Tretiak. It's about the 1972 series, play-by-play, volume 1 of the Canadian Games. I want everyone to know this is just about the first 4 games and the historical and the way Grant is breaking down even plays in the game, which no one ever does. And how you even depict the defensive and the offensive. This is just really fantastic by you, because these are parts of the game. Now, when I go watch the game, now it's very interesting to see everything that you're talking about. It really is. I have to tell you, before I go into game 3, a little synopsis,
sure.
We're on the downswing now. Even though we win in Toronto, we're kind of on the downswing after that tie in Winnipeg. We tied the game in Winnipeg because now we're going to lose in Vancouver. And correct me if I'm wrong, Grant, we lose the first game in Russia, correct?
They do, yeah.
And now, it's a black cloud. But
now you're down 3-1. Yeah, I think after game 2, I mean, you have to remember, much like game 1, the game was closer than it seemed. You're right. The Soviets were all over them in game 1 in the first period. Canada started to take a little bit, but then you had 2 of the greatest goals in hockey history for goals 2 and 3 in game 2, with Yvan Cournoyer flying down the wing and blowing around Alexander Ragulin, an old veteran Soviet defenseman, and then Peter Mahovlich scoring one of the greatest goals of all time, shorthanded. Where he makes a shinny move on the Soviet defenseman and goes in and dekes Tretiak out with a similar type move. Just a fantastic individual play. That
I still see him hanging on the net.
Yeah. You just don't see that stuff very often. So
we always tried to teach the Mahovlich move, we called it in Chicago, where Frank and Peter had this, well, more or less Peter, where he would fake it and be able to,
the old fake slap shot, and the defenseman, froze right up, and then he just walked around him. Like I said, you do it in shitty hockey growing up in Canada. Pete probably did, in Timmins outside with his brother one day, and was probably very shocked that worked. But Paladiev was probably also similarly shocked that he would do that. And they had been told that they would take slap shots. So he probably felt he was going to walk in and take a big slap shot. That's why he kind of froze up to block it,
Exactly.
So,
it's a
great goal.
I have to ask you, because this part of this, I don't know, but now with being with you on this now and the course of the book, are we still making changes going into Winnipeg in that 4-4 tie? Is Sinden still making changes?
Yeah, he only makes one change. He keeps the same defense, which was a good idea, and he brings in John Rattel. He had Bill Goldsworthy played very slightly in game 2, and again, nice foreshadowing. It's really like a book, in the way that you can see these things are about to happen previously in chapter 3. It's going to happen later on in the game, and in game 2, Bill Goldsworthy does some real stupid plays where he knees Petrov in the corner and things like that. So you're kind of thinking, why would you bring that guy back for game 4, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. Right. But the only person he changes is he takes out Goldsworthy, puts Jean Rattel in, and goes with 3 centers. So he goes with Esposito, Clark, and Rattel. The problem is Rattel plays very well in game 3, but doesn't play very much, because by then he's noticing that the Clark line is probably his best line. Phil Esposito is probably the best player outside Bobby Orr in the world at that time, so you got to keep him on the ice. And so Rattel just didn't have a real spot to play after that very much. So, but he does score a great goal and makes a great pass, so he plays it very well.
It was a part that I wanted to bring up a little bit earlier, because, like it says, your knowledge of this is just tremendous. Of course, the WHA had come in full effect, the 72-73 season. Are we seeing a different team if the Bobby Hulls the Derek Sandersons. Bobby Orr doesn't have the knee surgery. Are we seeing Cheevers, of course, would have been the goalie if he didn't go to the Crusaders. Are we seeing a different team? Are we seeing a more dominant or not?
I think that's a great question, and people have talked about that for a long time. I mean, Bobby Orr was just so good at that era, and he would have helped so much in the way of being able to control the play, as far as, which is what he did, take the puck, doesn't like what he sees, he'd circle around. I mean, no matter how great the skaters of the Soviets were, there was nobody that could skate as pure as Orr. Like Harlamov was probably as fast as Orr in the spurts, and so it made Maltsev as well. But
Sure.
Orr was such a unique skater that he could change gears so quickly that it really just would have. I mean, you're adding, it's like adding Michael Jordan in 1992 or 93 to a team. I mean, it just,
Right.
they have to be better just because you're adding Bobby Orr to the team. And Bobby Hall, as you see in 1974, was just a fantastic player as well for international hockey. Great skater, pretty tidy defensively, and he had that great shot. And he got Tretiak's number pretty quickly in 1974. He scores 8 goals in, I think, the series, because one was disallowed.
In the WHA Soviet series, yeah.
Yeah, I saw him play several times against the Soviets as a boy in Winnipeg, and he owned Tretiak. Tretiak even admits today that Hall shot intimidated him. So I think that sure, you had those two players. I'm not sure Sanderson fits onto the team. He had a bit of a bad temper, and not a great liver, as well as the partying. I'm not sure where he would fit as a center iceman. But Cheevers is another person that probably could have made a big difference. So could have J.C. Tremblay, another really great
the Montreal Canadian defenseman.
Montreal Canadian defenseman that really would have been great in international hockey. So yeah, you add those 4 guys. I think Canada probably wins maybe 5-3. I don't think it's 7-1 or anything like that. I think maybe the drama isn't the same, just because you're adding 2 of the 3 or 4 best players in the world at the time, and you're adding Bobby Orr, probably the best player of all time.
Right. And we're a little deeper in what we call the word depth. Do we blow a 3-1 lead in Game 3 of that 4-4 tie? Was it a 3-1 lead?
They did. So they went up actually 3-1 and then 4-2. So they score quickly. Parise scores, Esposito scores. That line is starting to really give them problems with Cashman and Parise in the corners. They're owning the Soviets, who are just feeding Esposito a lot now, and they're starting to take over shift after shift. The Clark line's playing well. I think Henderson scores another goal, and then Rattel scores. So they're up 3-1. Unfortunately, Frank Mihaljevic, who's about to sit on Tretiak the next game, does a terrible giveaway, and Big Petrov blasts a shot past Esposito, and it's like, yeah, they can shoot as well, just like the Canadians.
And, they were picking corners.
yeah, and so it's 3-1. And then there was showing the Soviet depth. He brings out a junior line, which is really a bunch of 20-year-olds who had played in the World University Games, which is called now we call them the headache line, but they're led by Anasin, Bodanov, and Lebedev, 3 young kids, great shape. Anasin would turn out to be a very fine player. The other 2 not as much, but they would just swarm and cause the Canadians all kinds of problems. And they ended up scoring 2 goals to tie the game in the second period.
Right.
Again, and that's when Sinden said, he goes, like, who are these guys? Like, where are they getting all these players? But I mean, the Soviet system had their own league. They had, probably 1 million kids playing hockey. I mean, it was big over there. So we just didn't know.
Exactly. And, I always tell people, why was that here? I mean, there was no Google. There was no YouTube.
No.
Either you saw them or you didn't see them, and you had to be prepared.
Yeah.
So, I always called that Game 3 the Russian comeback, because of, being down 3-1, 4-2, they never gave up. And then
they did. And just quick on that. If you look at it, when they're up 4-2, they'd outscored them since Game 1 now, like 8-3. So I mean, Canada looked like they were in control, but they really kind of weren't. Because Esposito was playing well in goal and the defense was playing better, but it was never, you're watching the games, you never really feel that Canada's dominating. They're on the scoreboard, they're ahead, they won 4-1, they're now up 4-2 in this game. But right. I think everybody in the arena at the time, kind of could feel that this was not a one-sided game.
Yeah, exactly. And you never felt comfortable. You just
Never comfortable. Yeah, you
never
kind of
felt.
feel that. Yeah, and the Soviets were in such great shape, and they were just so good offensively. You just could never. You can't. And as they find out in Game 5, you can't take 5 minutes off because they'll
Right.
score and they'll score and they'll score.
They'll
You know.
score.
Yeah,
Your opinion of what happens in Vancouver, was it a sloppy game for Canada?
that's a terrible game for Canada.
Yeah,
The worst. You're talking about players who are Hall of Fame players, Van Cornway, Brad Park, even Bill Goldsworthy was not that type of player, in the NHL. He was he's a goal scorer and he's a bit of a power forward, but he certainly wasn't take crazy penalty type players. They just lost their collective minds. I think the decisions for the lineup were very poor. You took out Parisi and Cashman, who were a great line with Esposito in games 2 and 3. And you inserted Goldsworthy and Dennis Hall. Goldsworthy was supposed to replace Cashman. Wasn't really, didn't have any synergy with Esposito, never played with him before. Goldsworthy had played with Parisi in Minnesota, but for whatever
sure.
reason, Sinden didn't know that and didn't keep them together, which would have made a lot more sense. He put in Dennis Hall, who was a nice player, but he wasn't a physical player, and he wasn't the type of guy who's going to contribute to Esposito, who needed the puck. So it was just like mind-boggling now that a very good hockey man like Sinden would make these kind of decisions. And then he put in the two gag line wingers, Gilbert and Hadfield, without Rattel. So it's like, well, what's the point of that?
Yeah.
Like they're used to playing with Rattel. They've played with Rattel for years. That's the best line in the AHL. Why would you not give them another shot together? Just very, very odd decisions and then he put back because Savard and Lapointe had a little trouble in games 3 with the kid line. They got scored on twice there. Lapointe was a bit injured. Savard turned out to be injured. So he put him back in Ari and Sealing.
Sure.
And it was really game 1 all over again. They just weren't. Don Ari plays a little better, but Sealing just seems to be overwhelmed again in much of
And I wanted to tell our audience that, of course, that before we went into a little bit here about Game 4, Game 3 ends in a tie 4-4. So they won. Yeah, they win the first game, of course, in Montreal. Game 2, Canada wins 4-1 in the 4-4 tie. Were we ever ahead in Game 4? This is what I can't remember.
No. So what happens is almost right away, Yuri Blinov, innocent player, just skating down the ice. Bill Goldsworthy comes on the ice in about the first minute and a half and attacks him for no reason, no reason at all. They have no history together. The guy's not an aggressive player. He's just an average player on the Soviet team. He's carrying the puck. Goldsworthy chases him down, cross-checks him, takes the penalty, and then skates by and gives, I think it was Harlamov a shot, and takes a penalty. Now, part of the problem, this is maybe where Derek Sanderson could have helped. Part of the problem is that Sinden didn't really put out great penalty killers for Team Canada, at least there. They get very good in Moscow, but here, he puts out a couple of guys. It was Esposito, I think Frank Mahovlich, who, as far as I know, are not penalty killers in the AHL at that time. The Soviets have the best power play that's probably the hockey had ever seen at that time. They just tick with the puck, and they do a lot of things what modern teams do now. They set up kind of in the half wall on the boards, and they would move that puck around and get a guy to commit, and then try and get to the side of the net and do that. So Phil Esposito plays his man well. He's got the point man, but Frank Mahovlich goes for a skate. It leaves the defenseman wide open, Luchenko, who takes a shot, but Boris Mikhailov, who was the greatest goal scorer in Soviet history at that time, comes out to the slot, gets a stick on the ice and deflects it in. A great goal. It happens quick, and now it's 1-0. So Sinden again starts rolling the lines. It keeps Goldsworthy out, and you can see Esposito talking to him like, come on, stop making these bad decisions.
Right.
But he puts him out again. 2 shifts later, he gets a big elbowing penalty in the boards, knocks the guy's helmet off. It's an obvious penalty, calls it, and it's deja vu all over again. There's different penalty killers this time, but Ron Ellis goes for a skate. They do the exact same play. Mikhailov tips it in. It's 2-0. We're talking the first 5 minutes of the game. And so Canada had to be demotivated. It's like, what just happened here? If you take a penalty, they're going to score on you, And at the time, guys like Cornway are skating around. They're chopping guys. They're spearing. They're just like, You're the road runner. That's not your game. You're a clean player. It was just crazy.
Player. So the disruptions, the frustrations now come out in Vancouver.
And just took them totally out of their comfort zone where, they're not playing their usual game.
Sure, exactly. Well, I want to kind of jump ahead to Phil's speech, and we'll probably have to end it on that note. But I have to tell you, we definitely now, it's amazing how time flies in these interviews. But, I know we just kind of are on the tip of the iceberg of this, but you're going to have to promise me now that we got to do another one. Yeah, we got to do a part 2 and probably a part 3, because again, I want to again hold up the book, Sitting on Tretiak by Grant Pennell. This is an amazing book. Grant, I want to read something to the audience that when I got the book kind of gives me goosebumps. There's always some kind of a passage.
Interesting to see what
right on the back, the 1972 Summit Series was the single most impactful, dramatic, and eventful series in the history of sports. This was a clash of cultures, hockey styles, and political ideologies. The 4 games in Canada were shocking to the North American hockey world and devastating to the Canadian fans. The author, Grant Douglas Pennell, takes us through games moment by moment, analyzing each goal, which you were doing right here in this interview on the brief note here today, forming a historical background on both the players and the international hockey history. I got to tell you, Grant, just in this 45-minute conversation I had with you, I want to say something that you maybe have never been told. You probably should have coached the team.
Yeah. I was 7 years old, so, but
but this is amazing,
hindsight, of course. Yeah.
This is amazing how you broke things down. And of course, for anyone that is looking and it was really into that era like I was, this is the book, Sitting on Tretiak, by Grant Douglas Pennell. This is fantastic read. It really breaks down everything from the history of the game and with the Soviets, the Czechs, and everything, and those 4 games in itself. I'll leave you with this. Elaborate on it, then I will have to let you go. But since we're in Game 4 and we're at the end of Game 4, what was your take on the speech of Mr. Phil Esposito?
Well, unlike your country, we don't have a lot of great political moments in history with great speeches, no Emancipation Proclamation or anything like that. So when they did a survey once about the greatest speech in Canadian history, and of course, being Canadian hockey, was the Esposito speech was the winner. And the real reason is that the Canadian fans had started to boo the players. They were very down on them, justifiably in some ways. These guys were trying their best. They were great players. They're playing opponent that they were completely unexpected and unprepared for, and they were doing their best. They were frustrated. They're human beings, and I don't think to this day it's fair they get booed like that. And I think what happened with Esposito's speech was he called out an entire country, and he just said, you guys need to stop this. We are trying our best. These guys are really good. I don't care what you were told before. We're in deep. We're Canadians. And I'm actually getting choked up just thinking about it.
Right.
It's who we are, and you need to support us. And we're not getting paid. We might play in the States, but you need to support us as Canadians. And what it did, really, it just unified the whole country. I can remember my mom saying, she was at Bridge the next week, and all the women, all they could talk about was Esposito's speech, how ashamed they all felt. Right. And after that point, I think like 3,000 people went to Russia, and the boys on the team say they had a whole thousands of get well cards, go get them and everything. Go get them. So it unified the country. It was no more like, look at these overpaid guys. It was like, we're at war here. These are our boys, and we need to be respectful and understanding of them.
It was incredible because I loved when he said at the end, the announcer was Johnny, who interviewed him.
Esau, yeah, I think was Johnny Esau, yeah.
Yeah, he said to him, "We're trying. You think we're not trying? We're trying. You think we're just out here just for a escape? We're not." Yeah. Grant Douglas Pennell, I really thank you for today. We have to definitely get together. This just was amazing. And again, I'm going to hold it up one more time for people to see this. We're going to get this out.
Available on Amazon. So
Yeah. Social media platforms will get it and you get it on Amazon. It is great. It's just incredible. And I need to finish it off myself. I just basically got into a good cusp of it. But you have done a phenomenal job, my friend.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, John.
I truly thank you for today.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Grant. Everyone, have a good day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant.